cognitive linguistics and hopefully shed some evolutionary perspective. So, yeah, true. And probably I failed to mention that Jordan works at Lund University, which is one of the top educational institutions in Europe. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks to Slavomir and to you as well for coming here so late in the day. You have studied quite a bit of language evolution, I understand. So some of these terms should be familiar. If not, mimesis, multimodality, and sociality or ultra-sociality, they will become so with time. I plan to talk about 1 hour, 10 minutes, and then have about 10 minutes for discussion if we all have the energy left around 6 o'clock. So, as the kind introduction said, the field that I feel I represent most closely now is not so much either linguistics or semiotics, the general study of meaning, or even cognitive science, which is a very interdisciplinary field, but this fairly new field that got together during the last 10-15 years and became established only the last 2 years, called cognitive semiotics. And as this diagram shows, cognitive semiotics is this unification of at least these three fields. The first edition of the Journal of Cognitive Semiotics was published by Peter Lang, started in 2007. Here is one issue that I helped edit on anthroposemiotics, meaning in culture, meaning for human beings, and biosemiotics, meaning in life in general. And the introduction there, not our introduction, but for that journal, says that cognitive semiotics integrates methods and theories developed in cognitive science together with those developed in semiotics, providing new insights into the realm of human signification. So quite general, right? But we need to be so general, I would argue, when we study language origins. We'll see whether you agree with me, but because language is not a self-contained module, and if it was, it would be even more miraculously to account for its evolution. But because language is connected to communication in general, to thinking in general, in complex ways, to other forms of meaning making, such as gesture, pictorial meanings, we need kind of a richer framework in order to disentangle, see what is special about language and also how it relates to these others. The Journal of Cognitive Semiotics is nowadays published by Mouton de Gruyter, or de Gruyter Mouton, and the introduction says again that it integrates perspective, methods, and insights from cognitive science, cognitive linguistics, and semiotics, placing meaning making into the broader context of cognitive, social, and neurobiological processes. One difference to the previous one, that this doesn't say that it's specifically human. So meaning in general, that means that arguably to understand what is special about human meaning making, we need to go to evolution in order to perform the study comparatively. Yes. So here are some key questions, and you see the first one, and several of them have to do with evolution. So here, one key question that you don't have to call your field cognitive semiotics to be working on a question such as this. Why and how did human communication and cognition co-evolve to be unique in the animal world as far as we know? All animals communicate, but we communicate in slightly different ways as well. What I'm doing right now has not been observed in any other species. What about the interrelation between biological and cultural evolution? Standard Darwinian biological evolution with what has been studied more lately, also using Darwinian or methods, but then what evolves is not the genes or even the individual organisms, but cultural elements, utterances, languages, applying evolutionary methods to languages, glossogenesis. I guess if you mentioned that term in evolutionary linguistics. Right? So what about ontogeny? So evolution is a fascinating issue, but our evidence about it is often very indirect. but we have to, as linguists, we can say some things about languages and about historical development of languages, and then if we study really hard, we can learn things from other fields such as archaeology, paleoanthropology, neurosciences. But all these are fairly indirect ways. A slightly more direct way to study development is through children. And lo and behold, the problem is not much better resolved when it comes to children than to the species as a whole. How does language develop in children? And again, here the cognitive semiotic approach is not just how language develops, but how meaning making develops in children. And once it does develop, how does it affect our thinking? One reason that many people believe that our cognition is special is because we're the only species, as far as we know, that use our communicative system for thinking. So language, for many people, radically transforms our ways of thinking. Not necessarily different languages in different ways, but just having a language as opposed not to. So cognition and communication are standardly kept apart in species, but we mix those things up. And then finally, what about the concept of embodiment that has been used and maybe even overused in cognitive linguistics and cognitive science? It's an interesting idea, but it has various versions of it. And my take on it here is what role does bodily experience play for consciousness, sociality, for thinking? Quite a lot of questions, and we won't deal with them today, but just I wanted to give you an idea of what cognitive semiotics works with. And this is one way to put it together in one diagram. The conceptual empirical loop. And so all the time in discussing issues such as language, meaning, gesture, iconicity, sound symbolism, we come up in kind of definitional questions. What do we mean by language? What meaning? Meaning, signification. Are they different? Are they not? But philosophers usually stay, and even semanticians of standard kind, stay on this corner. So they stay and discuss and elucidate and compare the concepts. But as empirical scientists, we take these kind of questions and go into the field and ask, how does language manifest itself? How does it evolve in the species? How does it develop in children, etc.? And on the other hand, unlike empirical scientists of the more narrow kind, we don't stay in the empirical also. We're not just interested in just the answers to these questions, fascinating as they are, but we want to bring the results from these studies back on the conceptual. So that's why I describe this as a loop, or perhaps even as a spiral, to help us better understand. So it's not just that, as Jakinov says, our theory of language develops our theory of language evolution, but also what we know about language evolution can help us develop our theory of what language is, ideally. So here are the three factors that were in the title of my presentation, and they reflect more or less the order in which I've worked with them the last 15, 20 years. The concept of mimesis, bodily mimesis, called by Merlin Donald, who I will quote in a moment, as the missing link in human evolution. It is mimesis that helps explain why we're unique. It's mimesis that will explain why we have language, not the other way around. According to Donald, then I kind of took that idea and ran with it and tried to develop it. But it leaves some problems. Where does mimesis come from? Why did it develop in us rather than in chimpanzees, for example? So something about the nature of human sociality, or even ultra-sociality, I think Tomasello used at 99, that concept, may help explain why we develop mimesis and eventual language. And finally, multimodality. What about the transition from mimesis to proto-languages and speech? So, bodily mimesis, the missing link. Here is the promised quotations from Merlin Donald, his first book. It has 24 years old by now, but I warmly recommend it. Some of the empirical work may be a bit dated, especially when he talks about neuroscience or genetics, but it's clearly interdisciplinary. Sorry, I clicked too quickly. I still haven't mastered the right buttons and where to press here. So, in The Origins of the Modern Mind, Donald defines mimesis as the ability to produce conscious, self-initiated, representational acts that are intentional but not linguistic. So we get a kind of idea of what this may be about, but the major part is, at the end, not linguistic. So what exactly is it? And then in the second part of the second quote, he gives even more features that we usually associate with language. Intentionality in various senses. I think in this particular he meant intentionality, intentionally communicative. So what I'm doing right now is intentionally communicative, but perhaps I'm communicating unintentionally, something with my posture or other ways, the clothes I happen to choose this morning, but at least when I'm intentionally communicative, as the way when we speak, this is a part of language, but it's also part of mimesis. It's also generative. So generativity, systematicity, Donald here claims it's also part of mimesis. A limited number of objects. This also reminds a little bit of language, right? The ability to say infinite things with an infinite number of statements with a finite means. So how is this different from language? Well, to understand this, we have to look at Donald's overall theory, and it's a macro-evolutionary four-stage theory, with mimesis forming the missing link between primate, episodic cognition that we share with the great apes, and then mythic language, linguistic modeling, high-speed phonology that temporarily, I think this still holds quite well. Notice he would say that speech, phonology, has at least 500,000 years behind it. Not necessarily all aspects of grammar, but at least more and more people nowadays are agreeing. This was very controversial 25 years ago. Now more people are saying language may have even speech may have an ancient origin. But if we take really what started to make us special and was manifested in Homo erectus about 2 million years ago, then it's not language per se, but it's revolution in skill, gesture, including vocal. So he talks about vocal gestures, some of the things that when we call it non-conventional hematopoietic expressions, like maybe a kind of a vocal gestures here. And first, the last 5,000–10,000 years, with external representations, writing systems, formalisms, we have theoretical cultures. Post-biological. Nobody's saying that we have evolved any special biological capacity genes for writing. So it's a grand scheme, and in the second book he gives a few more examples of what mimesis is about. It's about pantomime. It's about imitation. It's about gesturing, shared attention, ritualized behaviors, many games. It's also the basis for skill. So it's a very broad suite of capacities. And by the way, he's using an old Greek concept, mimesis. And all Greek means imitation, but when Aristotle and others use it, they use it also in this kind of sense of imitating action through action. So theater was very much about mimesis. And that's why you got a multimodality in theater, both speech, like Jesus, you had language, but you also showed with the help of your body. So, and interestingly, Donald says that mimesis served as a mode of cultural expression on the group level, and solidified the group mentality that is uniquely human. Okay, we start getting an idea of what he is getting at. This picture, drawn by artists, and that Merlin Donald let me borrow, gives us a kind of even more ideas of what mimetic culture of 1.8 million years ago until 1.5 million years ago could have been like. So this is, of course, an artistic rendition of Homo erectus. How is he different from us? What's the most obvious? Sorry? Extinct. Well, as far as we know, yes. On the other hand, nothing completely dies in evolution. It transforms. So he lives in us genetically and perhaps culturally. And many people, the hobbits that were found a few years ago on Florensis, the island, were thought to be one of the last living ancestor of Homo erectus. And okay, so how, an easier question perhaps, how is erectus different from the apes? No hair. Of course, we don't know that really. But it's possible that by that time our ancestors would have lost hair. What's more interesting is this. What is going on here? This old guy gesturing and showing what this young one has to do. What is he doing? It's what I'm doing now, or trying to do. Teaching. Pedagogy, intentional teaching, and cultural transmission over generations. Fire, truly upright posture, more or less erectus looked like us. In one popular science book that I read by a Swedish author, he says, well, all until erectus, if we met them today, like Lucy, for example, we would like to put them in a cage. If you met an erectus, you would invite them to tea. So this is the kind of species that there is no doubt about being a human being, Homo. Habilis perhaps before that, but there's more controversy. So what are the functions of bodily mimesis? Again, social learning through imitation and teaching. We're the best imitative species. Maybe other animals can imitate to various domains, various degrees, but we're the imitators par excellence. Skill through conscious rehearsal. Think about those of you who have practiced dancing or sport or anything, or piano, how much you have to imitate yourself. Rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. And sometimes you do perform this imitation in your minds. This is the steps I'm going to go. This is an example of kind of internal mimesis. And it's crucial for learning complex skills. And that's closely related to imagination and planning. And when you imagine, what are you going to have for dinner tonight, now that you're sitting here, or something else, you're performing also internal mimesis. But you can also use it for communication with others before language. You can enact what you're going to do tonight. You can play charades and so on. And even before a standard conventionalized speech, before grammar, you can use also your vocal apparatus to help disambiguate perhaps what you mean with your body. And as Donald said, you can combine all these things together for a complex culture. Not as complex as ours, but this is like miles, light years above in terms of complexity of what other primates have. Again, arguably without language. Now, I stuck my head out in a few publications, and it was not my term, it was Aaron Brown who first started writing about the bodily mimesis hypothesis. So I had to write it out in a paper that came out early last year, that the adaptation for improved volitional control of the body gave our ancestors advantages in the domains of imitation, empathy, and gesture-intentional communication, as we just saw. And this paved the way for the evolution of language with no other biological adaptation apart from improved vocal control. No other adaptations necessary for grammar, for example. At least this is the hypothesis. It could turn out to be wrong, but at least this is a kind of a hypothesis. How do we evaluate it? Well, let's first quickly go through the kind of support that it has. I already said some of these things, so I'll be quick. What happened with ergastor? The Asian species was called ergastor. The African ergastor, the Asian erectus. Sometimes people just talk about erectus, more as I've done so far. But there was a double increase in body size and brain size compared to predecessors. There was stable bipedalism, not just walking upright a little bit, but running, endurance running, for hunting, for scouting. The stone tools that became very different and very complex, the ones that you saw on the previous slides, those Acheulean axes that are very symmetric, bipolar. Modern archaeologists, need months and months of training to be able to perform something comparable. Migration all over Eurasia, and fire at least from 700,000 years ago. On the other hand, there's debate about this, but I think at least as far as the hyoid bone is concerned, it is of an archaic kind. It's not the kind that is found in even Neanderthals, not to mention Homo sapiens, that plays an important role in vocalization. And Bart de Boer and others have associated those with air sacs. So if you have an ancient kind of high bone, you could have these air sacs that help, like with chimpanzees, project your voice like this. But it's hard to make with air sacs all those vocal distinctions. So this is one piece of evidence that Erectus was very capable in many other ways, but did not have modern style speech. Neuroscience, here is a brain. I had just one slide about that, but we have to say something about that. Well, when I went to school, linguistics, not neurolinguistics, 20 years ago, and as I'm sure some still do, we talk about Broca's area and the premotor cortex, right? As one part of the language organ. And then what other part of the brain is part of the so-called language organ? Broca's area, and then you have Wernicke's area, which is over there roughly. Broca's, which corresponds to BA, stands for Brodmann area, the more neutral way of calling them, because Wernicke and Broca were two neurologists, and then calling them even more so the language areas was very contentious. And it was contentious because this is exactly the areas that correspond to what has been called the last 15 years, the areas supporting the human mirror neuron system, both in the premotor cortex and the parietal temporal cortex. And what we've learned by Arbit, by Risolatti, Gallesi, and many others, a popular book, Aikuboni, Mirroring People, if you want to learn about the mirror neuron system in a popular way, so that these are exactly the areas that are used for solving perception, action, matching tasks, gesture, production, comprehension, imagination, pantomime. And my proposal, unlike Donald is very skeptical about the mirror neuron system hypothesis. When you read his work and their work, there's no reason to say that this is not the hypothetical mimetic controller that he talks about. So this could very well be the mimetic control, and then language being built on top of this, just more or less as Arby says. My minor contribution here was that I found about 10 years ago, or well, 6 years ago, a study published 10 years ago that even outside of these classical language areas or mirror neuron areas, Brodmann area 4 and 6, they're involved in the perception and production of meaningless syllables. Pa, ba, ka, ga. No meaning. They're outside of the mirror neuron systems, but still, this you can see how possibly this system expanded from one that is controlling mimesis to one controlling speech. So this last circle is part of the extended system from mimesis or bodily mimesis to vocal mimesis. Primatology, for Tomasello and other people have argued that primate gestures are a much better step for evolving language than primate vocalizations. Why? Because they're individually learned, flexibly produced. On the other hand, vocal displays are mostly unlearned, genetically fixed, emotionally urgent, involuntary, etc. Well, more recent research has showed that this is an oversimplification. A paper by C and Zuberbühler and other people. But still, you cannot make a weakened argument that there is a quantitative, at least not a qualitative difference between the flexibility and volitional control of manual movements and gestures on the one hand, and the much less so flexibility and volitional control of vocalization and calls. Here is a journal that you should all know by now, Brain and Behavioral Sciences. Perhaps one of the most authoritative journals in the field. A paper that caused quite a lot of discussion about a few years ago by Wesson went and did a review of the capacities of human beings and of great apes, and maintained that the review shows that there are striking differences between humans and great apes in 8 of 9 domains. Which are these 8 domains? Can you guess? Well, here they are. And if they look familiar, I don't think it's a coincidence. Right? So, one very interesting thing is that Wesson says that no individual cognitive trait can be signaled as the key trait in differentiating humans from other animals. So it's not just theory of mind, it's not just executive control, and it's not just language. It's all these 8 things, at least, that differentiate us from the great apes. And if you take away language and take the remaining 7, I hope they sound a bit familiar, because this is exactly the kind of skills that are involved in bodily mimesis. Social learning, imitation, causal reasoning, hand-eye coordination, etc. So indeed, these 2 studies come together, I think, fairly nicely. Semiotic development, well, semiotic development is the term that we're giving to the development of the child's communication capacities as a whole, not just language, but also in terms of gesture and other. And there is evidence for at least some developmental primacy of pointing and iconic gestures compared to speech. And of course, we cannot say that the progression with which children's semiotic development goes matches the evolution, the stages of evolution, but at least you can draw some conclusions, some analogies. And now, on the other hand, speech and gesture do develop together, so we have to be careful about this developmental primacy. I'm not sure if you can hear the vocalizations, but I'll play you this little video of a 20-month-old Swedish child and her mother, and you will see how the child first performs spontaneously a mimetic reenactment of a frog jumping. Then the mother performs this just with her hand, and then the child now is not just imitating what the frog is doing, but the child imitates what the mother is doing. So you see 2 different kinds of iconic gestures. One of them, what we could call from a first-person perspective, when the child is reenacting the frog. The other, the child is kind of depicting, if you want to, the frog's movement. Both of them mimetic. Hop, hop, hop. Very nice coordination between the gesture and the vocalization. Hop, hop, hop. Again, we'll come to multimodality, and I think this is exactly the kind of matching between gesture and speech that characterizes modern language and can help us understand also the transition from mostly gesture, mostly mimesis, to mostly speech. Gesture studies, okay, just 3 pulled out from the internet. They happen to correspond to the 3 kind of types of signs: deictic or indexical, emblematic, and then iconic. Of course, we should understand that they're not clearly distinct types. You have elements of conventionality in all of them. For example, to point with the finger rather than to point with the hand. Children start doing it spontaneously with the finger, but various cultures have constraints on finger pointing, so you find much more whole hand pointing. Where there's taboos against fingers. Up, clearly convention, but not arbitrary convention, and we can talk about its history. Stallone here doing something iconic about fighting, but of course if we have no knowledge of who this is, what this is, we have difficulty understanding it. So there's elements of conventionality and iconicity in all of them. A study that inspired our own study that some of you participated in, I've heard, that shows also that gesture, mimesis, has a greater potential for communicating before it's been conventionalized. It was done a couple of years ago by these 3 people and published in Cognitive Science. And here they play games, putting pairs together, and communicator has to communicate either some emotion concept, an action concept, or an object by either only vocalizing, not speaking but vocalizing, gesturing, or the 2 together. And what do you see from this diagram? Well, just vocalization helped communicate emotions, not so bad. So you can imagine communicating fear and happiness and surprise with your voice. But it was not so great about communicating objects and even actions. And this is like 6 different trials. They see how they got better and better and better, the dyads, in communicating these others, but for some reason emotions fell down to 60%. Gesture was a ceiling effect, almost to 100% with all of those, and and you see better actions and objects and emotions, and the two combined even better, but this is not statistically significant. So we can come and talk, if we have time, about why the combination and when the combination of gesture and vocalization could be better than just gesture. A study that I actually talked about in one of my proto-language presentations is this one. It's a final review of some data supporting pre-linguistic mimesis intentions that are different, in which children are different from apes even before language. This is called an object choice task, which is one of the standard paradigms to study communicative intentions. Communicative intentions are not kind of a second order intentions. The philosopher Grice is usually referred to for the concept, and Michael Tomasello and others use it. Sparber Wilson in relevance theory use it also. So there's both an informative intention, I'm telling you something, but the communicative intention is I want you to understand the informative intention. So in this way it's a second order. And you need to understand something about communicative intentions to understand a pointing gesture. Why is he pointing? So even if you understand this, okay, this directs to this, what do I want to say with that? So you can either, here you can have a child or an ape, and you can hide something in one of these three boxes, and this is the bad guy who's doing the hiding, and there is a good guy who wants to help the seeker to find a reward. And it can help either by pointing, by putting a marker, a sticker for example, on top of it, showing a replica, the red box versus white box, or a picture of it. And the question is, will this participant understand? Fairly easy way to operationalize different kinds of, also playing with different kinds of cues, or as we can say, okay, first a picture is here. The way we in Lund did this task, we had 3 groups of children, 18 months, 24 months, and 30 months. Here you see, is it visible with all these lights? So getting the attention of the child here, and first when the child understands the game, then the curtain is going to be drawn, and the hider is going to hide the reward in the boxes. And then here we have a chimpanzee. And see, big disproportion between the number of participants. We had 72 children and only 4 participants, 4 chimpanzees. We had 6 chimpanzees to begin with, but 2 of them didn't want to play, and we couldn't convince them, so we ended up with only 4 that could be used. And you don't have to look at all these things about this table, but just to show that this is why, for example, semiotic analysis of these cues is necessary. They have various properties. So if you can point just with your gaze, or with your gaze and a point. You could put the marker, picture, and some of these are done with the body. Some of them are done with something external to the body, like holding a picture. Some of them involve like indexicality, closeness. Some of them involve iconicity, similarity. Some of them involve a direction. Some of them don't. So not all of these are going to be equally easy. And indeed, previous studies have shown that some are easier for children than others. We did the first study that combined 4 of these exactly for the same participants. And I don't have time to go on all the methodological details, but still see here we have point, marker, replica, and picture replica. So 18-month-old children, this is a chance level. So you see there's no effect at all for 18-month-old children for pictures and replicas, where we show the picture that looks like the box where the reward is. On the other hand, pointing and markers are passed fairly well. This is the number, 40, let's say, this is, okay, we have 6 cases, so 4 out of 6 have been passed. Just look at how different it is from chance. At 2 years, still very few and not significant number of children understand the iconic representations. First, at 2 years and a half of them do pass that. This is a different way of showing it. You can see how many of the children understood 5 out of 6 trials, and that's phenomenal beyond chance that they'll do so. Well, 40% of the children did that. At 24 months, 80% understood these, but still 0 understood 5 out of 6, at least, of the pictures. First at 3 years, so at 30 months, children do that. Now, what about the chimpanzees? So we confirmed what Tomaseau and other people had said. These things, especially pictures and replicas, are difficult. Pointing is earlier, and others have showed that pointing can be pushed down to 12 months with a lot of help. What about the chimpanzees? Well, this is the results from the 4 chimpanzees. And these you can see even their names: Linda, Manda, Penny, and Santino. The famous Santino who hides rocks to throw at people when they open the zoo. No significance at all. Apart from Manda and Penny, and interestingly, 5 out of 6, the only 2 kinds of cues that they seem to understand was one was pointing, the other a marker. So both of them had to do with indexical or directionality. Not, just reading Chris Knight, indexical signs are not fakes. They don't stand for anything else. They really point to something real. So that it kind of does make sense that these are the easiest ones. To summarize, children were better for pointing and markers at 24 than 18 months, and better for pictures and replicas than at 30 than 24. And roughly this was the progression that we saw. We also did a test on children's vocabulary sizes, and we found no correlation between their vocabulary and how good they were in this task. And we use this as partial evidence that language is not the key thing here. It's not that how good children were with language that helped them pass or not. This was another capacity that we would say has to do with mimesis. Tomaseau would say it has to do with intentionality. Chimps, okay, to try to help the chimp, we gave them in 2 different conditions. I didn't explain that. One was unfamiliar, experimenter, playing the task with them. But then we reasoned, if it's a zookeeper who's doing it, and the chimp has reasons to trust this zookeeper, it was almost like a surrogate mother for some of them, then they may get it better because of trust. Unfortunately, no. There was no effect of familiarity in these chimps. Some indication for that indexical was better than iconic, and in general, children better than chimps, not only due to language. Okay. So to finish off the first part of the presentation about bodily mimesis, that there's lots of kind of evidence from various sorts that our ancestors evolved something like bodily mimesis before language, and language built on top of that. This is similar, though not exactly like the gestural origins theories. And here, Adam Kendon, one of the big names of gesture studies, is expressing skepticism, saying that results such as this, the one that I just presented, and other people like Corbalis and others, yes, there's a lot of different indirect evidence that this first step in the evolution towards linguistic expression was taken with the employment of visible action or gesture. And yet, there is a seemingly the seemingly attractive hypothesis faces an insuperable problem. Language is overwhelmingly spoken. Unless we are deaf, we end up speaking. So why don't all of us use sign languages? Well, the argument is that this problem does not apply to bodily mimesis in the same way, because it is not a form of sign language, in which Corbalis, in a less careful publication, said that he envisioned original gestural origins to be a form of sign language in principle, if not in detail, similar to the languages that are used today by the deaf. And even Arbig, who was even more careful and distinguished sign language from proto-sign, says that in Arbig's model of language evolution, there is a stage called proto-sign, and that consists of gestures, but paired with meanings in a more or less arbitrary fashion. If anything was the point, was the kind of signs, gestures I was showing you so far, that they were not paired with meaning in an arbitrary fashion. They were in an indexical, in other words, motivated way. So, still, this was where I was maybe in Proto-Lang 3-4 years ago, and I was quite convinced that bodily mimesis is a sound theory. We just have to work out all the implications. What I want to do in the second half of my presentation is to focus on 2 problems that I've already mentioned. How we got there, how was bodily mimesis made possible, and 2, how move on from the mimetic to the mythic stage, or from predominantly gestural to predominantly vocal. And then if you look back at Donald's schema, it's the transition to the mimetic stage and the transition from the mimetic to the mythic that is the issue. Ultrasociality. Well, we know that we are social, and we know that we are the only system that has, the only being on the planet that has moral norms and religious beliefs, for example. But is it that that makes us so uniquely social? Well, we can go down a bit and say that we are the only system that has linguistic norms, and we're the only system that uses these norms, conventions, rules for honest communication. Again, what I'm doing here right now. But is this that makes us so social? What made this possible is exactly what, for example, botany mimesis was going to help explain. So we can move down and say, well, yes, with Tomasello, we're the species that has joint intentions and commitments to joint actions. But again, why are we so committed to these things? Why do we have joint intentions? Why are we so good at following gaze? Why are we the only grey tape with these very white eyes around, white around the eyes to make it possible to see where we're looking? Well, chimpanzees do not have that, making their eyes be more like dark glasses. So we are the only, and if we go down somehow and look at hunter-gatherers, what we find that it seems to be universal that groups share very hard-won resources from hunting and from gathering with everyone in the group, not just with the best hunters or the most attractive women. No, with the old ones, with the young ones, with everyone in the group, and there are very strict norms about this. And finally, we're the only great ape, if we take this classification, where we have care for infants and children is shared. So we are the alloparenting species for Hardy. And the argument that I'll suggest, I don't have time to elaborate it, is that this is the direction in which sociality developed, from alloparenting or cooperative breeding forward. I saw that some of you may looked a bit skeptical. Are we really so kind? We read all the time about the kind of cruel things that we're doing to each other and to our fellow human beings. And what about the great apes? We've learned from people like Duval that it was a misconception that they're the beasts while we are the angels. Yes, it is a misconception. Apes are also capable of degrees of empathy and concern, etc. But even Duval in this publication says that in these core areas, empathy, internalization of rules, sense of justice, commitment, community concern, we have gone further than the other primates. Tecumseh Fitch, in an often used quotation, says that the cooperative sharing of information is a central puzzle in language evolution. And in this book, The Social Origins of Language, that I'll be talking about the next 15 minutes, the authors of the introduction says that despite many disagreements that the authors and us writers in this book have, we all agree that social groups of unprecedentedly cooperative, trusting relationships were necessary for language to begin to evolve. So again, where from? Because this degree of cooperation is problematic for standard evolutionary theory. What used to be called is genocentrism. If you wonder what standard evolutionary theory is, buy a book called The Selfish Gene. So, by Stephen Dawkins. And here is a principle, a fundamental evolutionary principle by modern evolutionary writers, Richardson and Boyd, in the book Not by Genes Alone. They say that costly group beneficial behavior cannot evolve unless the benefits of this group beneficial behavior flow not randomly to the genes that give rise to the behavior. They accept that kind of standard principle. So you cannot just be collaborative, cooperative, while you and your nearest not benefiting in this. I mean, no, you will. Those who only benefit from this are going to proffer, and if they're not the one that have these pro-social impulses, then the whole cooperation will break down. There have been multiple attempts to accommodate the extreme humans' pro-sociality and standard evolutionary theory. One of them being kin selection, which can explain why we are most cooperative with those we are biologically related to, our children perhaps to begin with, brothers and sisters, and further on, and it can help explain child care and why we care so much about others, but it cannot explain cooperation with non-biological relatives. And even those hunter-gatherers we talked about before, they're not all closely biological related. So reciprocity is the next method to try to explain this. Is kind of a tit-for-tat logic. If I'm kind for you, you're kind for me. If I do something bad, you punish me, you never collaborate with me again. Again, you can show that this works in small groups. Otherwise, it's vulnerable to so-called free riders, people who reap the benefits of the kindness of others but do not reciprocate. Now, reputation is the next mechanism you could put on top of that and say, aha, we remember those free riders, we remember those nasty ones, and we won't collaborate with them anymore. And again, that works, but that requires memory. Are we really going to remember who was that? And in some cases, you just have to observe from the outside who was collaborative, who not, and you have to be as bystanders. And you need displaced communication to tell others, oh, that guy is someone trustworthy and that not. And you need, finally, to stabilize the system, punishment, retribution. These are sometimes called the 3 R's. Reciprocity, reputation, retribution. It's easy to remember them. And they can be shown in evolutionary theory to stabilize cultural patterns and punish those who don't follow them. The problem is to explain how they developed in the first place. So, the paradox can be resolved, I would suggest, by a broader evolutionary approach where selection is not just on genes, not just on individuals, but also on groups. And it's not the mainstream theory, but it's getting more and more support, even by people like E.O. Wilson, sociobiologist. And the idea is fairly simple, that a selection across these different levels can go even against each other. So you can still be very competitive with other individuals in the group, but on the level of the group, you have common interest against other groups. Even on the level of your body, your cells have often different interests as opposed to you as an organism. And that's how. And if the cells do that as opposed to the organism, you get cancer. So yes, selection can operate, and it doesn't mean it's fault-free and it works always. But with a broad theory such as this, and an elaboration of this by Boyd and Richardson, called group selection, you can see how collaboration can explain. One slide to show the mechanism of how group selection or cultural group selection can operate. Once you have social learning of the kind that we showed before, and mimesis is very good for social learning, remember, we do stones this way, not that way. You make cumulative cultural evolution possible, and you develop different groups with different cultural patterns. And then heritable variation within them. And you get implicit or explicit competition between these groups. When we say competition, we often imagine warfare or something like that. That doesn't have to be the case. All you need to have is that some are going to, let's say, reap the benefits of the environment better than the others. And automatically with that, you get a form of group selection. And then, quote Boyd and Richardson, selection within these most successful groups, which have been successful because they have been collaborative, favors genes that give rise to new, more pro-social motives. Moral systems enforced by systems of sanctions and rewards increase the reproductive success of individuals who function well in such environments. And this in turn led to the evolution of other regarding motives like empathy and social emotions like shame. So through a logic like this, you can see, to put it simply and roughly, that empathy and shame is not just something that culture learns or religion tells you should be. It's something that we have deep within us, to various degrees in various people. But there's been a tendency for those who have had these features to be rewarded, evolutionary, and that's why we have them within us. Again, some unresolved issues. What led to this cultural learning in the first place? Christopher Bohm, who studies both hunter-gatherers and chimpanzees, says, well, the ability to communicate with displacement is critical for this to develop because communities must continuously track everyone's behavior, and group members are often dispersed. And there is evidence for this kind of cumulative cultural evolution only from the last 200,000 years ago, from pigmentation, from when technology started to ratchet up. But there is evidence for human ultra-sociality, or at least Homo erectus style of sociality, much earlier. So where did it come from? I will very briefly summarize 4 theories of the origin of human sociality which address these questions. And I'm going to, these are, Dunbar, Deacon, Tomasello, and Hardy. The criteria by which I will evaluate them is first, why? Do they provide a plausible explanation of why trust evolved in us, or our genus, rather than in the great apes, for example? It's not just enough to say, oh, it's beneficial for the groups. Why did it happen in chimpanzee groups, for example? What kind of selection? The kind of questions I just dealt with, individual, group, multi-level. When did it happen? What kind of paleoanthropological evidence do we have to say when it happened? And what about anthropological evidence from above all hunter-gatherers? And what about children? Because the way children develop, what aspects of children's cognition develops first, children's intersubjectivity, and so on can help us understand that. Vocal grooming is a theory that you must have heard about. That's the evolution of language through grooming and gossip. Well, Dunbar says that our ancestors lived in unusually large groups, and to maintain cohesion in such groups, for primate you need something else than just ordinary bodily grooming. So that's how vocalization came as a substitute. But it doesn't explain why this doesn't happen with other primates that live in large groups, like gelada baboons. He says that this can be explained on individual level selection, but can you really define what an optimal group size is, irrespective of the environment and the other groups? He believes that this happened fairly recently, the last 500 to 200,000 years, but this doesn't explain the early origin of human or Homo uniqueness in erectus and so on. And his magical number of 150, which he believes that the neocortex corresponds to in ours, does not correspond to the data as clearly as he says in this book. At least anthropologists have questioned it and says that, for example, the smaller group of a band of 30, 40 people or a larger of a tribe are at least as important, and he doesn't focus on children. Now, Deacon, among many other interesting things in his Symbolic Species book, proposes the sex contract. Wake up now if you're falling asleep, because it gets a little bit more interesting. So he believes that it's the transition to monogamy or marriage that was what accounted for our pro-sociality. So, and why was this necessary? Well, there was kind of evolutionary pressures, not because God came and says you have to live in couples. No, it was because that was, according to Deacon, the only scenario that allowed us to survive in an environment where there were many males competing for females. There were immature infants with large brains that needed father provisioning, and the father needed to provision children that they had reason to believe they were offspring. So how was this solved? Well, this was solved through some kind of a convention that corresponded to marriage or proto-marriage. Others have said, well, this could be in part resolved through pair bonding, emotional pair bonding, which is also something we have within us. You can see while morals corresponds to marriage, pair bonding, love, corresponds more to the kind of innate sentiments of empathy. And this kind of reciprocal need for sex, to put it roughly, reciprocal altruism and group, and perhaps implicitly also group selection is mechanisms, because those groups again that developed were more collaborative than others who didn't, who fought too much within themselves, and so I think there is an implicit group selection argument there. He believes that this happened on the savannah, but again, relevant anatomical changes including bipedalism happened before the savannah. People know that nowadays, and he has, in this book at least, he had a fairly old-fashioned view of the nuclear families as more or less being culturally universal. Well, anthropologists say that fathers are, unfortunately, famously irresponsible and cannot be relied on to commit to their own progeny. It's much better to bet on the extended family than on your spouse, if you're female, according to anthropologists at least. And so this division of labor that he describes between males and females he doesn't deal especially with children. Now, a theory that does deal extensively with children is Tomasello's. He is a developmental psychologist to begin with. And he developed this notion of shared intentionality that mentioned already in relation to pointing and so on. And he says that at some late point invokes processes of social identification and conformity for the sharing motive. He talks about mutualism, like this thing starting off by having shared interest in hunting or in gathering. But again, this doesn't really explain why chimps both hunt and gather, but nothing like this has been observed in them. So he doesn't explain, at least in this book. By the way, Tomasello has managed to write 2 books since then, and including the last one from 2014. So it's hard to keep up the natural history of cooperation or so. And then even here, okay, so I won't spend criticizing Tomasello more, because even when I was writing this paper, Current Anthropology published a co-authored paper in which he develops some of these things. I want to spend rather a bit more attention to the theory that I think is most explanatory of where this thing started, and that's alloparenting. In this book, Sarah Blair Hardy, called Mothers and Others, she develops this alloparenting or cooperative breeding theory. And points out that for the first thing, cooperative breeding is not unique for us, taking care of not just our own children, but others' children, cooperating in childcare across sexes. It happens also in tamarins and marmosets, small critters, primates that are not great apes. Very small brains, but very pro-social. They have these almost human-like impulses to give. So what was the weird thing that happened with us, according to Hardy, is at some point around 2 million years ago, due to kind of bottlenecks that Deacon and Dunbar were describing, our species changed reproductive strategy. We developed starting raising our children together in a cooperative way. Thus, in species, in great apes already that had large brains, that were quite Machiavellian and cunning, you got these pro-social impulses. So we became a cooperative breeding in a primate already possessing the cognitive capacities typical of the great apes. So this allowed very fast rates of reproduction, despite large, costly babies. Well, here's, by the way, I'm stealing pictures from Hardy's book. This is not a mother, this is a grandmother who is mouth feeding her grandchild. She is giving the little boy food here through a kiss. So it's not just an emotional kiss, it's also giving, she's chewed the food, and there was a technical term for this that I've forgotten. So how this happened? Well, in part due to individual selection. Hardy says that mothers can overshoot their capacities to provide, and fathers can vary. You don't have to rely on the fathers, because both sexes involved in a highly fluid system where alloparents often provided this assistance. And interestingly, there was selection also on the children. Not only the mothers and the alloparents to be most sharing, but for the children to pay attention for who to please, who to smile to, who to point. Infant signals and babies were better, but also, I don't think, in frankness, Hardy has really accepted this argument. But I believe that she talks about social selection. I think there's also group selection that implied in her model, that groups that adopted alloparenting survived disproportionately compared to those who did not. A bit like with the Deacon scenario. When did it happen? Hardy, using again Donald's figure, thinks this happened exactly with Homo erectus being maybe not the first cognitively modern human species, but the first emotionally modern human species. But you can push that back, maybe at least the beginning of alloparenting to the beginning of bipedalism and Ardipithecus to 4.4 million years ago, with reduced male canine teeth, coevolution bodily changes, prolonged childhood, etc. So maybe what led to us anatomically, not just emotionally or cognitive, was some form of child care change. And the empirical evidence mostly comes from, she's an anthropologist, so she does field work with hunter-gatherer societies like the Himbala Yanomanu, the Akka, the Kum. And there you can document how a newborn child can have up to 20 different carers from both sexes, okay, female predominantly, but also male, and not just the fathers, often not at all the fathers. These males, for example, there on the picture, are neither of them fathers of those children. And you can see how, if you can see in this lighting maybe not so well, but the children are very, through gaze, are calibrating who they're interacting with and they're pleasing them. So the children get, again, quote, far more motivation to pay attention to the willingness of others who might be available to care for him when his mother disinclines. This quote, I won't read all of it because time is progressing and we still have about 10 minutes for multimodality to talk about, is that cooperative breeding, according to Hardy, was the pre-existing condition for this complex co-evolutionary dynamics that also involved expansion of childhood, bigger brains, etc. So if we compare the four theories in terms of these 5 questions that I had, how, why, how, when, anthropological evidence, developmental evidence, question marks indicate problematic evidence or irresolved issues. Blank cells indicate simply no answer, not addressing that issue. You would see in my objective, hopefully, review that Hardy covers most of these cells, so she gets the winning star. I won't have time, but in my paper, as Slavik knows, I do say that it's not winner-take-all. There's ideas to get from all the other models, and you can combine them to various degrees. But in the name of time and argumentation, let us sum up and continue with the last factor, multimodality. And if you remember, cooperative breeding's sociality was what could help explain how mimesis evolved. And mimesis involves a lot of sharing, pedagogy, etc. Now, the final step is, what about speech? So why am I producing all these sounds now rather than giving this whole lecture using a form of sign language? Well, this book, published by Collins, gives a kind of reply to the objection by Kendon and many others that it's difficult to explain the transition from gesture to speech if you assume a gesture origins of language. And I like this kind of long quote, but again, the point is that we keep on talking about the point in which this happened. And what if the point was a transitional period over 500,000 years, say from the appearance of Homo erectus to that of archaic Homo sapiens? And what if during all this time humans regularly communicated bimodally, only gradually shifting from a code that foregrounded gesture to one that foregrounded voice? Remember this, foregrounded gesture, foregrounded voice. Claim that many people would agree, human communication has been multimodal from the start, just as it's multimodal right now. It's not a transition from one to the other. As the next diagram shows, if I can, taken from Collins, this here color shows a gestural vocal communication system, foregrounded, dominated by gesture. And the idea was that at the time of Homo erectus, this was the dominant form. Vocalization was para-gesture. What happened with time over 1 million years ago, and if there has to be any point to be called the transition, it should be something like 500,000 years ago when this imbalance became more clear, where the communication that is predominantly vocal and where we have para-language or gesture that is very closely connected to speech would have happened here. So this is just a diagram with some circumstantial evidence, given what fossilizes, what not, what this could have happened, but it gives you kind of an imaginable scenario where you don't have kind of miraculous transition from gesture to speech. Rather, you have multimodality to multimodality, change from focus, dominance of one to the other. Now, in a thesis at the University of Edinburgh, Erin Brown tried to do some computational models and psychological experiments to try to work with how this transition could have happened. And this is also what we did here in the same way, to try to study in what cases vocalization can give you extra information, in what cases gesture, it could be also that due to kind of a cognitive load, not just gesturing but also vocalizing, you have to pay attention to both. You may get a worse effect rather than a bias. 1 + 1 is equal to 1.5 rather than 2. So she does a very nice summary of 3 types of gestural primacy theory. So when you hear about gestural primacy, that human evolution, language evolution starts with gesture, you can ask yourself, what type of gestural primacy theory is this? One type we can call a switch theory, and we already said that there are problems for switch theories. So, why, if communication was almost entirely gestural, mimetic, did it have to switch over to vocalization? Given that sign language is just as efficient and powerful, when people didn't know that sign languages were just as functional as spoken languages, you can think, oh well, because there's not enough functionality in the body. Nowadays we know that this is wrong. So switch theories have a problem. In immediate multimodal theories, the fact that there was a nice separation between iconic motivated gesture and arbitrary vocalization. McNeil's theory, including his evolutionary theory from 2012 that I haven't referenced, are of this kind. They have a problem because they underestimate the degree of non-arbitrariness in speech. This is a hot topic nowadays. We were living under the Saussurian dogma for many years, thinking the speech is arbitrary, language is arbitrary. No, it's not. There are 4 different senses of the word arbitrary in the Corps de Linguistique Générale, and the only one that is arguably valid is arbitrary means conventional. And once you say that it's conventional, you can show many cases in which conventional expressions are only partially motivated, which Saussure also acknowledges. So our work, the work by Mark Dingemans, by Imai and Kita, show that the non-arbitrariness or sound symbolism is much more prevalent across languages than what we thought before. So the theory that she supports is actually the one that we support, but she finds problems in it, that there's kind of a gradual multimodal. That means that there was a shift from balance, from emphasis on gesture to emphasis on speech. But then she asks, these type of theories do not provide a reason why one modality is now predominantly symbolic, that is less motivated, less iconic than the other. So she gives 3 factors and 1 experiment, and then we'll end with this. First, this can be shown both in terms of modeling and conceptually, that there is simply more capacity. So both the gestural modality and the spoken modality can express conventional, more or less arbitrary meanings. But when it comes to non-arbitrary, iconic representations, the gestural mimetic modality has much more capacity. So if something in the communication, let's say the number of vocabulary items, requires you to limit, to have less iconicity, then you would have a switch towards the vocal channel. And the other argument is that for this to happen, it's too late if, as Arabi assumes, the gestural has already become more or less arbitrary in a proto-sign way. The gestural, the mimetic, has to be there as context while this conventionalization process happens to help interpret the vocal, the less transparent part. And finally, yes, this happens even more so when the groups increase and when you have social transmission of this proto-language to people who have not invented the forms to begin with. Here is an experiment that she performed with something to support at least some of these arguments. If we have time in the discussion, we can say how exactly. I know I'm rushing a little bit quickly because of time. So she calls this a foreign language guessing game. And so participants watch videos of someone speaking in an unfamiliar language. Actually, words were taken from Japanese. And they were asked to guess what these words mean, and then told them what the answers were, and then afterwards check their memory for those words. And there were 3 conditions that you might find familiar. So one of them was vocal only, the other was vocal plus an iconic gesture, and then vocal and an adapter. And here you see the 3 different conditions. So either here we have only a vocalization. This person is saying Nanda Monai. Here he's saying Nanda Monai and performing an iconic gesture, and here he's doing so and rubbing his shoulder. So which of these three pictures, contexts, gives you most information about which one of these four objects he's talking about? Any suggestions? Sorry? The middle one. Because, and what does he mean? Violin. I think it's there are other possible resolutions, but at least both the guess is correct. But notice she was not just counting number of guesses; she was counting memory afterwards. Then the hypothesis was that gesture plus vocalization was going to have the best effect, and you're not going to have an interference effect of the kind that the vocalization may stand in the way, or gesture may be in the way for remembering. And here are the results. Somewhat surprisingly, she did not find, sorry you cannot see because of the black here, there was no, this was the best condition, vocalization plus gesture, but the difference between that and only vocalization was not significant. On the other hand, the differences between vocalization and gesture and vocalization and arbitrary gesture was significant. So the one on the right was the worst case. So we can use that as argument that multimodality can help, or at least, like in this case, if the multimodality is meaningful, the gesture is interpretable, it doesn't have to be in the way. Let's remind you again of this study, and the question that we asked ourselves for our ongoing project: when would multimodal communication be more effective than just gestural? And one idea was that Fay and others did not find any advantage in that last case, the multimodal combined, was because they only had simple concepts to communicate. But normally when we speak and communicate, we don't just communicate hungry, tired, ball, violin. We talk about events and even narratives or stories. So in our study, we had three different kinds of, we said we want to communicate events. And we had an action, an agent, and a patient, and we had 4 of each possibilities, 40 events, with 5 different agent-patient combinations were designed and drawn up as unique cartoon-like pictures. We gave 4 actors these 16 of these 20 to enact in 4 different rounds, and it was a fairly complex experiment, and those of you who've been there at the last stage can probably appreciate how difficult it was. It was even more difficult for us to design it, to think of how we're going to balance orders and so on. But what is in yellow is important now. That we had one condition in which we had only gestures, and the other had gestures and non-linguistic vocalization. And we were expecting, after all the counterbalancing was done, to have a better effect in the second case. Precisely because these are not just simple concepts, but these are complex ones. Well, the results preliminary so far are that indeed this was a complex task. Participants had between 32% and 66% correct of these. Of course, mostly at the end of the 4th try. There was a kind of a learning going on there. But unexpectedly, the gestural, the unimodal, had a higher average percentage, 53% than the multimodal. And in the first 2 rounds, this was the case, that the gesture was always better than the gestural plus vocal. On the 3rd round, R3, it was reversed. And at the end, it was neutralized. So one preliminary conclusion here that we haven't discussed yet properly is that vocalization does not help communication initially. It does not necessarily help communication initially. It may even be distracted due to cognitive load, dissonance, and others, but it seems to do so with experience. So one point is to think about this actually in terms of rounds, in terms of and indeed, in all these cases of multimodality, it was not like a one-shot type of communication. Things were repeated and became familiar and otherwise. So, I went 5 minutes over my expected time, but let me summarize. And for your good news, I have only one slide to summarize this with. Now I've put them in the right order. I started first talking about bodily mimesis, which was my entry point into the field. Then I moved to what made bodily mimesis possible, arguably something like alloparenting. and then multimodality. This is the right order in which, at least I suppose, they evolved in our species during the last 4 million years. So Hardy's argument that a transition to alloparenting is arguably the best explanation for the initial evolution, but this is only the initial evolution of sociality. This interacted with other factors, such as intentional communication, imitation capacities. So it's not all human sociality can be traced back to alloparenting, but at least the prime mover possibly. Now, Donald's macroevolutionary model, it's too grand in many ways, having these 4 stages for the last 6-7 million years, but it has been influential and productive for asking questions such as this: what happened between the stages? What were the key transitions? Were they gradual? Were they, to put basically what looks like discrete capacities into a continuous Darwinian framework. And finally, the transition from communication based on bodily mimesis to relatively arbitrary speech would not have been possible with modality. I'm aware that I was not able to show this, but the most convincing and important part of Brown's thesis is to say that without multimodality there would not have been any motivation to make this gradient switch from predominantly gestural to predominantly vocal communication. If it was only gestural from the start, you end up in this kind of switch problem. So, thank you very much. And some of the people who helped me along this long way. And thank you for staying.
Yes, a few minutes questions.
Yes.
Okay, so perhaps
There is one question? Yeah.
A very brief one. I would like to inquire about your understanding of generativity that was mentioned in one of the early slides. And another question concerns possible research on these issues regarding prosody versus gesture, and foreigner talk and gesture, and pigeonization, or communication through a pigeon.
Right, right. There's several things, but let me say something briefly about all of them, though I have perhaps least to say about pigeonization. But starting with generativity, it's a very confusing concept always, and you have to look at the context to see what the author means. So even in generative grammar, people have different views. Does it mean axiomatic? Does it mean compositional? Does it mean generating, etc.? Donald meant it to denote some kind of combinatorics. That it's not just a holistic communication system. That even when you're reenacting, you're reenacting, let's say in our experiment, you're reenacting, say, once the speaker, you're reenacting the act and others. But this may be one way in which he overextended his concept. I think you have to say that even if you have something, an action has some potential for combination, but it doesn't have the same kind of generativity that languages have. Sign languages also, even proto-sign. So that's what I've been trying to tone down when I worked about it in my pieces. I give as other definitions to explain it. Let's say the fact that it's the iconic properties of my mimesis are more important. Prosody, yes. It's in that diagram that Collins was using, there were two different kinds of prosody. One that are more linguistic, that was kind of included into the dark colored path of the vocal channel. On the other hand, he had one that was kind of an emotional prosody, that was the
intentional part on the right. And I know that linguists have big discussions about where the borders go between the linguistic and the non-linguistic. So, and also, I'm aware that looking for sound symbolism, for non-arbitrariness in speech, much attention has to be paid to prosody, not just to the segments. So people who talk about, let's say, the frequency code, the Wohala and others, a lot of it is about vowels, frequencies and others, but there's much to so prosody of both the more intentional linguistic, the more paralinguistic emotional is crucial, and the little I know about the neuroscience of prosody is that it's also complex. The right hemisphere is clearly involved, at least in the emotional, but perhaps even in the discourse-related prosody. What was the last one about pigeonization? And I'll tell you just something that I'm kind of shocked me a little by. Didio and Levinson are one of the new stars of the field, and they became famous by arguing for Neanderthal language. And they give circumstantial evidence through genetics, through DNA, FOXP2 mutations, and other factors, and also this high iron bones, etc., that Neanderthals had languages. At the same time, they give the following puzzle. They say, well, our ancestors left Africa 70,000 years ago. If they had the same language 70,000 years ago, it's very hard to explain by historical linguistic methods that the diversification of the world's languages, across all the continents. On the other hand, if they met the Neanderthals along the way, and the Denisovans, and if they're right that both the Denisovans and the Neanderthals had languages that varied much more from sapiens languages, then you probably can explain today's diversification of languages through pigeonization between Neanderthal and sapiens. So I don't know. I just read it the other day, and I know they're looking for features using statistical methods for properties of language that are non-African languages, because the non-Africans all have Neanderthal genes. But we heard them in Vienna. They did a great attempt to look through all kinds of statistical methods for these features, and they failed. So yes, but if anything, pigeonization is like this, great mutation factors in cultural transmission that could lead to rapid language change. Yeah.
You could venture one short question.
Yeah.
Can we say that sign language is more developed in those less developed societies, like tribes, for example, because they use sign language in a different way than we do?
Okay. Again, if mimesis, I would say, is more developed or more utilized. Sign languages, I think we have to be careful to separate them a bit from mimesis. They have clearly mimetic roots, but they have complex grammars. They are generative in the full sense in which languages are. Mimesis is not, but if you look at Lewis, one of the co-authors of this book, he does field work with the pygmies. And I've seen wonderful films in which they narrate hunting elephant stories, and there is so much reenactment is along the way that they're sailing, and there's so much vocalization and others. So, and again, we have to be careful to say not primitive one of development, but traditional. And I think, by the way, that could be a reason. I mean, Japanese and Korean are one of the few languages that stand in the way of a kind of explanation why some languages tend to have much more onomatopoeia sound symbolisms than others. Those that are less dependent on a written tradition. So I think that for some odd reasons, we Europeans have started, until recently at least, to discredit both gesture, body language, and onomatopoetic expressions, and to feel that the language is truly language when it becomes arbitrary and systematic and clear from all these paralinguistic. One good thing about multimodality in video and other kinds of communication is that we started to evaluate that languages. It's hard to draw even the boundary between the spoken and the vocal due to their close interactions. There's a long answer, but yeah, yes. But again, maybe to bring back the importance of mimesis and multimodality. It's a fascinating thing, but maybe we should end on this question, because If you remember the loop, the conceptual empirical loop, studying language evolution is kind of so much interesting in itself. There's so many puzzles, how it happened, why it happened, when it happened. But it's also interesting because it brings us back to the question, what is language? And we are reminded that some of the definitions of language that we learned from Saussure, we learned from Chomsky, we learned from Langecker and others, are maybe not the only possible definitions. And you see all the time, language is being redefined and redefined in every new generation. And again, it's not as Jacquinot says that you first have to fix your notion of language and linguistic theory and then look for its explanation of evolution. But what we learn about evolution can help us understand also the phenomena of language. Okay, shall we call it a day? And see you next time for the 5th visit. Thank you.
It was a bit over the capture
No. Usual state.